the 16th of November, 1944. A cratered farm track on the eastern edge of the Huertgen Forest near a shattered village called Garrison. If you are the crew of this gun, you have spent the whole autumn watching field artillery burst against German concrete and change nothing. Now you are doing the thing the training manual calls suicide. You have towed a 155mm gun out from behind the hill and into open ground. Then you laid it over the sights at a pillbox you can see with your own eyes, close enough to make out the firing slit. The gun is an M12. The men who serve it call it the Doorknocker. You seat a shell that weighs almost as much as the man next to you. You stand clear of the recoil, and you fire straight into the wall that had stopped an army. For 3 months, that wall had been winning. This is the story of the West Wall bunkers in the Huertgen Forest, the belt of reinforced concrete that cost the United States Army somewhere near 33,000 casualties across the grimmest autumn of its war in Europe. And it is the story of the 2 American weapons that finally cracked those bunkers open. A tank with a bulldozer blade that buried them alive, and the 155 that punched through 6 feet of concrete at a range where the crew could read the numbers stenciled on the door. You already know the answer arrives. What you are here for is how it worked and what it cost to get there. The ground here is half the enemy. The Huertgen is a stretch of dense pine and fir about 5 miles east of the Belgian border, roughly 50 square miles of it, and the Germans had spent years turning it into a trap. The trees were not wild. They had been planted in tight, straight rows decades before and left to grow into a black canopy so thick that a man at noon walked in a green dusk. There were few roads. The fire breaks and trails funneled anyone who moved into narrow lanes, and every lane had been measured in advance by a machine gun. One American who fought there put it plainly. "I never saw a wood so thick with trees," he said, "as the Huertgen." Woven through that forest was the West Wall, the belt of fortifications the Germans called the West Wall, and the Allies called the Siegfried Line. In this sector, it ran in depth, band behind band. Dragon's teeth, the rows of squat concrete pyramids meant to stop a tank cold. Belts of barbed wire. Minefields laid so thick along the trails that a single engineer battalion would later lift more than 1,300 mines out of one stretch of ground. And anchoring all of it, the pillboxes. A West Wall pillbox was a serious piece of engineering. The walls and roof ran to around 6.5 feet of steel, reinforced concrete, thick enough to shrug off a 500-pound bomb. The firing slit was small and angled. It was sighted to sweep a fixed lane of forest. The garrison lived below, in a heated chamber with bunks and an ammunition store, and fought from a firing room above. The whole structure sat low and squat, banked with earth and screened by the pines, so that the first an attacking rifleman knew of it was often the muzzle flash from a slit he had walked straight past. And the bunkers were not fought alone. They were sited in clusters, each box laid out so its neighbors covered its blind spots, which meant that the moment you rushed one pillbox, you walked into the fire lane of the next 2. That is why the line held the way it did. In one sector on the forest's western edge, around a place the maps called Rafflesbrand, a handful of pillbox crews held their ground against American attacks for months on end, trading a few yards of pine for a fresh company each time. A box that should have fallen in an afternoon could cost a battalion a week and still be there at the end of it. Against that, the American infantryman had almost nothing that worked. He came in on foot because armor could barely move off the few roads, and the roads were mined and covered by anti-tank guns. His own field artillery, the thing that saved him everywhere else, turned into a liability here. Shells fired into that dense canopy did not land on the enemy in his hole. They detonated in the treetops, 40 and 50 feet up. The blast sprayed splintered steel and jagged wood down on the men below. Tree bursts, the soldiers called them. The only shelter was to hug the base of a trunk or to get a log roof over a foxhole fast. The German gunners knew the American reflex was to hit the dirt in the open, and in this forest that reflex was the worst thing a man could do. So the forest ate divisions. The 9th Infantry Division went in first, in September, and again in October, and its 47th Infantry Regiment was fed into the same ground 3 separate times. In a little over 30 days, the 9th took around 4,500 casualties, and it had gained ground you could pace off in hundreds of yards. A rifle company in that forest could lose the equivalent of its entire strength in a single week, and then lose it again, replacements walking in green and going down before the veterans learned their names. One young lieutenant, ordered forward on his first morning, was heard to say almost to himself, "So this is combat, I've only had 1 day of it." Then came November, and the worst of it. The 28th Infantry Division, a Pennsylvania National Guard outfit, was ordered to take the village of Schmidt and the high ground around Vosnack and Kommerscheid in the heart of the forest. The attack went in over a single deep gorge, the Call Trail, and it came apart. German counterattacks retook Schmidt. The trail choked with knocked-out armor, and the division came out of the woods gutted. In a matter of weeks, the 28th took around 6,000 casualties. One of its rifle battalions, the 110th Infantry, was reduced to 57 men still able to fight. Another regiment, the 112th, went from around 2,200 men down toward 300. The division was combat ineffective and had to be pulled out and rebuilt. This was the gap, the stretch of this story where the United States Army had no answer and knew it. The men were as good as any in the world, and it did not matter. You cannot outfight a concrete box with a rifle. Field guns burst harmlessly in the trees. Tanks bogged and burned on the mined roads before they reached the bunkers at all. For weeks, the arithmetic ran one direction only, and it ran against the attacker. Ernest Hemingway, who walked that forest as a correspondent, reached for the one comparison that fit and called it a version of Passchendaele, the drowned charnel ground of the First World War, only with the added horror of the tree bursts overhead. If the forest was a trap, why did the army keep feeding divisions into it? The answer sat a few miles beyond the trees, on the Raw River. Upstream stood a set of large dams, and whoever held them held the river. If the Germans kept the dams and the Americans tried to cross the Roer downstream, the defenders could open the gates, send a wall of released water down the valley, and strand any force caught on the far bank. So the High Command wanted the ground east of the Huertgen, and the direct road to it ran through the worst of the concrete. The bunkers were the lock on the door to the river crossing, and that is why Command kept turning the key against them no matter what it cost. The proof that the wall could be broken was already sitting a little to the north, in open country. In early October, near the town of Übach, the 2nd Armored Division had put armor and infantry through the west wall together and cracked a breach in it. The difference was the ground. Out there, tanks could actually reach the pillboxes and work them over at close range. Inside the Huertgen, the same wall held, not because the concrete was thicker, but because the forest kept the heavy machines away from it. Solve the problem of getting weight up to the bunkers, and the bunkers were no longer unbreakable. That was the whole puzzle, and the autumn was spent solving it. Something had to change, and it did not change with a single wonder weapon. It changed with a method, and with 2 machines that made the method work. The method was the assault team. Instead of throwing a company at a bunker head-on and losing half of it in the open, the Americans broke the problem into small parts. A team of 3 or 4 men working with the combat engineers would crawl up on one pillbox from more than one direction at once. One group stayed low in front and hosed the firing slit with rifle and machine gun fire, blinding it, keeping the German gunner's head down and away from his sights. While the slit was pinned, the other men worked around to the blind side and the rear, where the pillbox had no eyes. There they used what they carried: a bazooka rocket against the steel door, a satchel of explosive shoved against the base, a pole charge, a demolition block lashed to the end of a length of timber, jammed hard against the embrasure or the door and blown, a phosphorus grenade to fill the firing room with choking smoke. And where the garrison still refused to come out, the Americans brought up the flamethrower. Sometimes the man-packed M1 carried on an engineer's back. Sometimes a Sherman rebuilt to throw fire from its hull. The flame did not have to reach a man to work. Very often, the doctrine noted, the simple sight of a burst of flame licking across the field of view of the slit was enough all by itself. The white flag would come out. Nobody inside wanted to learn what the next burst would do in an enclosed concrete room with one door. That was the infantry method, and it worked, slowly at a cost. What turned it from a grinding attrition into something that actually broke bunkers were the 2 heavy weapons the title promised you. Start with the humbler of the 2, because it may be the cleverest thing in the whole campaign. The Tank-Dozer. Tank-Dozer was nothing exotic. It was a standard Sherman with a bulldozer blade bolted to the front, a piece of engineer equipment meant for clearing rubble and filling craters. Somebody worked out that it could do something else. Pillbox fights through its firing slit and lives through its door. Both face outward at ground level. So the tank-dozer would grind straight up to the bunker under covering fire, drop its blade, and simply push. It plowed dirt and broken concrete up over the firing slit until the slit was blind and choked. Then it worked around and heaped earth against the door until the door would not open. The garrison inside were suddenly in a sealed concrete box with no way to see and no way out. There was no assault to repel because there was nothing to shoot at, only the grind of the blade and the daylight going away. Time after time, once the earth started coming up over the slit, the men inside chose surrender over burial, and a white cloth would come waving out of a vent before the box was fully sealed. A weapon that had held off a battalion was beaten by a blade meant for moving dirt. And then the Doorknocker. The M12 gun motor carriage was a strange, ungainly-looking machine, and only about 100 of them were ever built. It took the chassis of an early Sherman family tank and mounted in an open fighting compartment at the back a 155mm gun, a long, heavy field piece dating back to a French design of the First World War. It was so big for the vehicle that a broad steel spade had to be lowered to the ground at the rear to soak up the recoil, or the whole machine would have hammered itself to pieces with every shot. It carried only 10 of its own shells and worked in a pair with an ammunition carrier, the M30, which hauled the rest of the rounds and part of the gun crew. On paper, the M12 was built to sit well back and lob shells over long distances. In the fight along the German border in the autumn of 1944, the crews used it for something the designers had not drawn up. They took this enormous gun and rolled it right to the front, into direct line of sight of the bunkers, and fired it flat, straight at the concrete, over open sights. And the 155 did what nothing lighter could. Its shell could drive through around 7 feet of reinforced concrete at ranges out to 2,000 yards. Up close, over open sights, there was no argument to be had. The gun that had already been used this way against the concrete forts around Metz was turned loose on the west wall, and the crews gave it the name that fit: the Doorknocker. This one difference is the whole reason the direct fire method won. Fired the normal way, from behind cover, arcing shells down at a pillbox, 155 was almost useless against a target that small. A gunner might burn 25 or 30 rounds just to register a single hit on a box half buried in a forest. But rolled up to point-blank range and fired flat, the same gun needed only a handful of direct hits to crack the structure open, because now the crew could see the slit, aim at the slit, and put shell after shell into the same spot. A defense built to defeat the shell coming down from above had no answer to the shell coming straight in through the front. One cold morning, it all comes together, and you stand with the crew. It is the 16th of November, the day the great First Army offensive kicks off along the whole line, and you are back at Grosnitz where this began, on the eastern shoulder of the forest. The pillbox ahead of you has held up the advance for the better part of a day. Riflemen have gone at it and come back short. So the call goes out for the heavy gun. The M12 comes forward down a track. Its own weight is chewing to mud, the driver picking a line between craters, the rest of you walking it in on foot, because a machine this size draws every eye on the German side. 200 yards short, the driver swings the nose on. The spade drops and bites the ground. In front of you, low and grey and banked with earth, is the thing that has been winning. The riflemen out to your flanks open up on the slit, and the German fire slackens as the gunner in the box loses his view. The gun captain lays the tube by eye, straight down the barrel at the concrete. Plowed. The shell goes in, near 100 pounds of it, and the breech closes. Everyone stands clear of the recoil path. The gun captain drops his hand. The Doorknocker fires, and the whole machine slams back against the spade, and where a field gun would have thrown a puff of dust off the top of the bunker, this shell goes into the face of it and takes a piece away. Plowed. Fire again into the same spot. On the third or fourth round, the front of the pillbox is no longer a wall, it is a hole, and the men who had held that ground against everything the infantry could bring now understand exactly what has changed. Before the crew can range the next shot, a piece of white cloth is working its way out through the wreckage. The box is finished. The advance moves on to the next one. This was the pattern that broke the belt, and the receipts are in the after-action records. The engineers were doing the same brutal arithmetic across the whole forest. The 15th Engineer Combat Battalion alone, in the thick of the fighting, lifted 1,352 mines and reduced 125 pillboxes, one box at a time, under fire, with charges and blades and flame. Off to the north, in the street fighting for Huertgen, a dozer tank of the 745th Tank Battalion had already shown what a blade could do against German concrete. Broke an opening for the infantry at a rail viaduct leading into the city. And the photographs the Army Signal Corps brought back from the border tell it in a single frame. One of them, dated that same 16th of November, shows an M12 near Grosnech caught in full recoil, the gun slammed back on its spade in the act of firing directly at a German pillbox. The Doorknocker at work, exactly where this story stands. The reduction of the bunkers did not make the forest cheap. Nothing made the Huertgen cheap. Through the second half of November the 4th and 8th Infantry Divisions and the armour attached to them ground east through the shattered villages, Huertgen, Kleinhau, Groschau, toward the open country and the raw river beyond. The fighting in Groschau went house to house through cellars and wrecked walls and cost heavily for a nondescript cluster of buildings. Armour sent down the cleared roads still ran onto mines and hidden anti-tank guns. This was a campaign that was won a bunker, a street, and a tree line at a time, and it was still being paid for in full even as it was being won. One of the men who fought for the village of Huertgen itself was an officer in the 121st Infantry Regiment of the 8th Division named Paul Boesch. He came out of that fight and wrote it down in a memoir he called Road to Huertgen, Forest in Hell, and the title is not decoration. Boesch's account is one of the reasons we can still stand inside that fight at all. A company officer describes the pillboxes, the tree bursts, the cold rain that never stopped, the mud that swallowed the roads. And he describes the slow, box-by-box work of prying the Germans out of concrete. It was November going into December. Men were losing their feet to trench foot in the standing water of their own foxholes. And still the line crept forward, because the method now worked and the machines had come up to make it work. The 4th Infantry Division paid the same kind of bill in those same weeks. It took something close to 6,000 casualties of its own in the late November and early December fighting. Its rifle companies were worn down to a fraction of their strength and rebuilt on the move with replacements. Add it up across the whole campaign, and the forest had consumed the fighting power of 6 American divisions before it was done. And it was very nearly done. By the middle of December, the trees were falling behind the leading troops, the bunkers along the axis of advance were silent, and the road to the Roar was open where it had been sealed since September. The date usually written down for the end of the battle is the 16th of December. It is remembered as an ending for a second reason, because that is the very morning the Germans threw their last great offensive into the Ardennes to the south, the attack the world would call the Battle of the Bulge. The Huertgen fight closed just as that storm broke, its bunkers cracked and its line pierced at last. But it was being won. That is the turn this whole autumn had been waiting for. Look at what the fighting had actually produced by the start of December. The pillboxes that had been unbreakable in September were now being cracked on a schedule, box after box, by crews who had learned the method and had the machines to make it work. The 22nd Infantry Regiment, the outfit Hemingway had walked in with, fought its way clear through to the eastern edge of the trees and looked out at last on open ground, the raw plain, sunlight after weeks under the black canopy. The belt that had swallowed 6 American divisions had a hole punched through it, and the men going through that hole were walking past pillboxes that were now silent, buried, or blown open from the front. The lesson the United States Army carried out of that forest was written in concrete and steel. You do not beat a fixed defense by being braver than it, and you do not beat it with the field artillery that wins the war in open country. You beat it with the right tool applied to the exact weakness of the thing. A bunker fights through a slit and breathes through a door, and both of those can be buried by a blade meant for dirt, or blown in by a gun heavy enough and close enough to argue with 6 feet of concrete. The Tank-Dozer and the Doorknocker were not glamorous machines. One was a tractor blade on a tank. The other was an old French gun on a chassis, too small for it. Between them, up close and over open sights, they did what the finest infantry in the world could not do with rifles, and they took the west wall apart, one box at a time. If you crewed one of these guns, or drove a dozer blade up to a bunker, or walked one of those fire breaks with an assault team, this channel wants to hear it, so leave it in the comments. And tell me which pairing you want next. The battleship guns that reached the coastal forts at Cherbourg. The flame tanks that went into the tunnels at Metz. The engineers who beat the dragon's teeth with nothing but charges and nerve. Name it, and we will go find how the unbreakable thing met the thing that beat it.